On the afternoon of July 14, 1969, the United States Treasury and the Federal Reserve released a joint announcement, only a few paragraphs long, that quietly killed the largest money America had ever placed in a citizen's hands. Effective immediately, the $500 bill, the $1,000 bill, the $5,000 bill, and the $10,000 bill would be withdrawn from circulation. There was no vote in Congress. There was no hearing, no floor debate, no campaign. The official reason, printed in the announcement itself, was lack of use. That reason was, at best, half of the story. The $10,000 bill was the largest note an American could legally hold, and in 1969 a single one carried the purchasing power of more than 85,000 of today's dollars. By the Bureau of Labor Statistics' own inflation figures, folded into a piece of paper thin enough to hide inside a paperback book. The man engraved on its face was never a president. The government that issued it spent the following decades pulling everyone it could find back out of circulation and feeding them into shredders, and by the time the Federal Reserve published a count in 2009, only 336 of them were known to survive anywhere on Earth. Over the next several minutes, I am going to show you who the man on that bill was and why the Treasury chose him, what the $10,000 bill was actually built to do, because it was never really designed for you, what the 1969 order actually targeted and the law that followed it 15 months later, where the surviving notes are today, including a wall in downtown Las Vegas that kept $1 million behind glass for nearly half a century, and what one of these bills sold for at public auction 2023. And there is one detail in this story that almost every retelling leaves out, a decision made in 1970 that is still quietly reshaping what you can do with your own cash this week. Hold on to that, because it is where this whole story has been pointing for 50 years. Here is exactly what the record is going to give you in order. First, the identity of the man on the $10,000 bill, a Treasury secretary who once put his own portrait on American money while he was still in office, and why that habit followed him onto the largest note ever circulated. Second, the bill's actual job, which had nothing to do with shopping and everything to do with how banks settled scores with other banks before electricity did it for them. Third, the anatomy of the 1969 withdrawal order, including the two-word justification the government printed, and the 15-month gap between that order and the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970. Fourth, the census of survivors, all 336 of them, from a horseshoe-shaped display on Fremont Street to the vaults of the Smithsonian. And fifth, the current price of one, including the auction in 2023 where a single $10,000 bill brought $480,000, and why a bank teller would still be legally required to take one from you at face value and destroy it. One note on method before the story starts. Everything here comes from the paper trail, Treasury circulars, Federal Reserve statements, Bureau of Engraving and Printing production records, contemporary press accounts, and published auction archives. Where the record goes silent, I will tell you it goes silent. This channel reads the documents the textbooks skip, and this story lives almost entirely inside those documents. The man on the bill is Salmon P. Chase, and to understand why his face ended up on the most powerful piece of paper America ever printed, you have to go back to the winter of 1861, when the United States Treasury was, in plain terms, broke. Chase was Abraham Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, a former Ohio governor and senator with undisguised presidential ambitions, and he had inherited a government that funded itself through tariffs and land sales at the precise moment it needed to fund the largest war in its history. By 1862, per the Treasury's own wartime accounting, the Union war effort was consuming well over $1 million a day. The banks had suspended gold payments. The government's credit was in question on 2 continents. Chase's answer, pushed through Congress as the Legal Tender Act in February of 1862, was the greenback, paper money backed not by gold in a vault, but by the bare declaration that it was legal tender for all debts. It was, at the time, considered a radical and possibly unconstitutional act, and Chase himself had doubts he would later act on as a judge. But it worked, and Chase did something with it that tells you everything about the man. When the first $1 legal tender notes were engraved, the portrait on the face was not George Washington. It was Salmon P. Chase, the sitting Treasury Secretary, on the most widely handled note in the country, in what historians have long read as a campaign poster printed by the hundreds of millions. A year later, in February of 1863, Chase pushed through the National Banking Act, which created federally chartered banks, a uniform national currency, and, for the first time, a banking system Washington could actually see into. He never became president. Lincoln eventually made him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court instead, where, in a turn almost too neat to believe, Chase ruled against the constitutionality of the very greenbacks he had created. He died in 1873. And then, half a century later, the system he built reached back for him. When the Treasury shrank American bills to their modern size in 1928 and assigned portraits across the denominations, presidents took the small notes, the ones ordinary people would touch. The high denominations went to the builders of the financial machine, and the very largest note in public circulation, the $10,000 bill, Series 1928 and then Series 1934, carried the face of Salmon P. Chase. The last of them came off the presses at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in 1945. That is the object at the center of this story. The architect of America's first surveillance-ready banking system, printed on the one piece of American money that could move a fortune with no record at all. What happened next is the part the announcement in 1969 never said out loud. To see why the bill had to die, you first have to see what it was actually for, because at no point was the $10,000 bill meant to buy anything in a store. In 1934, per census-era figures, a typical American family earned well under $2,000 a year. A single $10,000 bill represented something like 5 years of a family's total income. No shop kept change for one. No farmer was paid in them. Their real function was institutional plumbing. Before electronic transfers, when one bank owed another bank a large settlement, when a clearinghouse balanced its books at the end of a day, when a corporation moved a payroll between cities, the physical instrument that moved was the high-denomination note. A courier with a slim envelope of $10,000 bills was a wire transfer with legs. And that is exactly why the bill's legitimate purpose began dying almost as soon as it was born. In 1918, the Federal Reserve connected its 12 regional banks with leased telegraph wires and began moving money as messages. The system that grew into what is now called Fedwire. Decade by decade, the settlement work migrated onto the wires, and by the 1960s, the banks, the original customers for the big bills, no longer needed paper at all, which left a strange residue. The $10,000 bill still existed, still printed, still legal, but its only remaining users were people who specifically wanted what the wires could not offer. Value that moved with no counterparty, no ledger entry, and no witness. That is the context for July 14, 1969. The withdrawal announced that day under the Nixon administration was engineered with real subtlety, and the mechanics matter. Nothing was confiscated, nothing was recalled. No citizen was ordered to surrender anything, and every note remained full legal tender, which meant the government never had to compensate anyone or defend a taking in court. Instead, the Federal Reserve simply instructed the banking system that whenever a $500, $1,000, $5,000, or $10,000 bill was deposited, it would be shipped to a Federal Reserve bank and destroyed rather than reissued. Death by attrition. The bills would strangle slowly, in silence, every deposit a small funeral. The stated reason was lack of use, and for banks that was even true. But then look at the calendar. 15 months later, in October of 1970, President Nixon signed the Bank Secrecy Act, the law that required banks to file reports on cash transactions above $10,000. Read those two acts together, and the design becomes hard to unsee. First, eliminate the only instrument that let $10,000 travel as a single anonymous object. Then, flag every cash movement of that same size inside the banking system. The threshold in the law matched the largest bill on the street almost to the dollar. The government never printed that connection in any announcement, and I will not claim to read intentions the record does not state, but the timing sits in the documents for anyone to check. The bill Salmon Chase's face rode on had become the last blind spot in the visibility machine Salmon Chase designed, and in 1969 the machine closed the blind spot. Now watch what the withdrawal actually did to the notes that survived, because three very different afterlives tell you what this money became. The first afterlife is behind glass on Fremont Street in Las Vegas. Beginning in the mid-1950s, the Horseshoe Casino downtown, the property made famous by Benny Binion, displayed $110,000 bills mounted inside a giant golden horseshoe, $1 million in a single frame. Per contemporary press accounts, it became one of the most photographed objects in Nevada, and for decades tourists stood in front of it for free souvenir pictures, ordinary people posing with more currency than most of them would earn in several lifetimes. Here is the detail that matters for our story. Through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, while that display stood, the notes inside it were appreciating faster as artifacts than the casino floor around them earned as a business asset. In 1999, the display finally came down and the notes were sold to a private currency dealer, per reporting at the time, at prices far above the $1 million printed on their faces. The government had turned money into a collectible simply by promising to destroy the rest of the supply. The second afterlife was never public at all, and it is the one the government kept for itself. In December of 1934 and January of 1935, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing produced a note larger than anything a citizen ever touched. The $100,000 gold certificate bearing the portrait of Woodrow Wilson with a print run of 42,000 notes. It was never circulated. It was never legal for a private person to own one, and it still is not. Those notes existed for exactly one purpose: settling balances between Federal Reserve banks, government money for talking to itself, and the surviving specimens sit today in places like the Smithsonian's National Numismatic Collection. Sit with that asymmetry for a moment. When anonymity in large denominations served the institutions, a $100,000 note was perfectly acceptable. When it served the public, $10,000 was too dangerous to keep printing. The third afterlife is not American, and it is not historical because the 1969 template turned out to be reusable. In May of 2016, the European Central Bank announced it would stop issuing its own largest note, the €500 bill, citing concerns that the note facilitated illicit activity, and issuance ended in 2019. The playbook was identical to the letter: no recall, no confiscation, the note stays legal tender, and attrition does the killing quietly. That same year, Harvard economist Kenneth Rogoff published a book called The Curse of Cash, arguing that governments should phase out large denomination currency entirely, precisely because untracked cash is where the system loses its sight. Whatever you think of that argument, and serious people land on both sides of it, notice what it concedes. The 1969 withdrawal was never really about one obsolete American bill. It was the first full-scale test of a general principle: that the size of a banknote is a dial. Governments can turn to decide how much financial life happens beyond their view. So let me now pay off, one by one, the 5 things I promised at the start, because each of them closes a loop this story opened. Answer 1. The man on the bill. He is Salmon P. Chase, Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, the father of the Greenback and the National Banking Act, the man who put his own face on the first $1 legal tender note in 1862 while angling for the presidency he never won. The 1920s Treasury put presidents on the small bills the public handled and reserved the giant denominations for the system's own architects, which is why the largest circulating note in American history honors a man most Americans could not name, and why the choice was less an honor than a signature. The builder's mark stamped on the machine's biggest part. Answer 2. The bill's real job. It was interbank ballast, a physical settlement instrument for banks, clearinghouses, and large institutions in the era before wire transfer, worth roughly 5 years of a typical 1930s family income per note, and its legitimate purpose was already terminally ill by mid-century once the Federal Reserve's telegraph settlement network matured. By 1969, the only demand left was demand for untraceability itself. And that is precisely the demand the government decided to stop serving. Answer 3. The Order and the Law. July 14, 1969, the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, under the Nixon administration, announced the withdrawal of everything above $100, citing lack of use, with destruction on deposit and no compensation owed because nothing was technically taken. October 1970. The Bank Secrecy Act creates mandatory reporting for cash transactions above $10,000, a threshold matching the just eliminated top bill. Together they form a two-part mechanism: remove the anonymous container, then alarm the doorway it used to pass through. And that pairing, not any cinematic story about gangsters with briefcases, is the actual engine of this history. Answer 4. The Survivors. Per Federal Reserve figures published in 2009, 336 $10,000 bills remain outstanding, alongside a few hundred 5,000s, out of everything printed between 1928 and 1945. The Binion hoard of 100 notes was dispersed into private collections after 1999. Institutional specimens rest in the Smithsonian's National Numismatic Collection and in Federal Reserve exhibits such as the currency display in San Francisco, and nearly everything else that ever existed went into the shredders exactly as the 1969 order intended. Deposit by deposit, year after year, without a single dramatic moment anyone could photograph. Answer 5. The price. Every surviving note is still full legal tender, which produces the strangest arithmetic in American money. Walk one into a bank, and the teller must credit you exactly $10,000, after which the note ships to the Federal Reserve and dies. Walk the same note into the collector market, and the record says otherwise. In September of 2023, per Heritage Auctions published results, a single series 1934 $10,000 bill in exceptional condition sold for $480,000, roughly 48 times its face value, with condition, series, and serial numbers driving enormous swings between examples. Collector markets move, and nothing in this episode is buying or selling advice. But the structural point stands on its own. The government's promise to destroy the supply is precisely what made each survivor worth a fortune. Scarcity manufactured by the shredder. Which brings me back to the detail I told you to hold on to at the start, the one almost every retelling of this story misses, because the most consequential decision in this whole affair was not made in 1969. It was made in 1970, and it was a decision not to do something. The $10,000 reporting threshold in the Bank Secrecy Act was never indexed to inflation. Read that again slowly. In 1970, $10,000 was the price of a house in many American counties, the equivalent of well over 80,000 of today's dollars by the Bureau of Labor Statistics measures. Today it is the price of a used car. The words of the rule have barely moved in over half a century, but inflation lowers its real bar automatically every single year, which means the net designed to catch the largest bill in America now catches transactions. A 1970 legislator would have considered unremarkable, and it tightens further without any new law, any new announcement. To be clear, cash reporting rules are ordinary law. Complying with them is simply what banks do, and none of this is legal or financial advice. If reporting rules touch your own affairs, a qualified professional is the right person to ask. The point here is structural, and it is the quiet punchline of the whole story. In 1969, the government decided how big anonymous money could be, and in 1970 it froze the definition of big, and then it let arithmetic do the rest, forever. Consider the scale of the shrinkage. The largest American bill today is the 100, unchanged since 1969, and it now buys roughly what $12 bought in that year. The effective ceiling of private American cash has fallen by nearly 90% within a single lifetime. And there was never a day when anyone voted on that. If you take one idea away from all of this, take this one. The $10,000 bill is not a piece of trivia. It is physical evidence that the size and reach of cash is not a fact of nature, but a policy choice, one that was exercised on a single July afternoon in 1969 with a few paragraphs and the two words lack of use, and one that has been compounding quietly ever since through a threshold frozen in 1970. 336 survivors are left to prove the choice was made, each one wearing the face of Salmon P. Chase, the man who built the visible banking system and ended up, by pure historical accident, as the portrait on its last invisible corner. The next time someone tells you money is just money, remember that a note worth 85,000 of today's dollars once passed from hand to hand in this country with no record at all, and that ending that fact was considered worth doing. Carefully, permanently, and almost silently. This channel exists to find the decisions that were made about your money before you arrived, and there are more of them in the record than anyone has time to tell. If this one was worth your 20 minutes, a like genuinely helps these stories find the people who want them, and subscribing means you will be here for the next document worth reading. I will see you in the next one.